All right, so we're going to dive into this, and you are really wanting to understand crack cocaine, like what it is, what it does, and how it fits into society. You sent over like a super detailed Wikipedia article as a starting point, so
Yeah.
that's great.
It really is fascinating how crack cocaine, or just crack as most people know it, is basically just cocaine, but you can smoke it.
Oh, okay.
And just that like one simple change has like huge implications for how intense the high is and unfortunately its addictive potential.
Yeah, the article did mention that it was labeled as highly addictive, even the most addictive form of cocaine in like some medical texts. Is that true?
So the Manual of Adolescent Substance Abuse Treatment really does call it out as like the most addictive form of cocaine. So it's
Yeah.
a pretty serious warning, about how powerful this drug can be.
So how does something as simple as baking soda, I mean, like turn cocaine into something you can smoke? I mean, the chemistry sounds complicated.
You would be surprised how like straightforward the process actually is. Yeah, so it's just this like basic chemical reaction between baking soda, which is a base, and that hydrochloride part of powder cocaine. And when they get heated up, they react and create what's called free base cocaine, which is basically crack.
So the baking soda like unlocks the smokable form of the drug.
Exactly. The heat is like the key ingredient here. It like changes the melting point so that the cocaine can vaporize when you heat it, and then you can inhale the smoke and then get like a way faster, way more intense high.
Wow, it's interesting how just a simple chemical tweak can have such a huge impact on how a drug interacts with the body.
Absolutely. And that intensity is like a big part of why crack cocaine is so dangerous.
And speaking of dangerous, the article did mention that crack that you get on the street is often cut with other substances, so that's pretty concerning.
Yeah, cutting basically means diluting the crack with other stuff. Sometimes it's like harmless things like sugar or whatever, just to like make it seem like more, but it's not always that innocent.
So like someone could be smoking some pretty nasty stuff mixed in without even knowing it.
Exactly. One example is levamisole, which is actually a drug that's used to treat like parasitic infections in animals. So,
Oh, wow.
yeah, not something you want to be inhaling into your lungs.
Definitely raises like all sorts of questions about the risks involved with using street drugs. I mean, you really never know what you're getting.
You hit the nail on the head there, and like not knowing just adds another layer of risk on top of what's already a dangerous drug.
Okay, well, let's like change gears a little bit and talk about the history of crack cocaine. The article mentioned a crack epidemic that like gripped the nation back in the 80s. Can you shed some light on like what happened and why it became such a widespread problem?
So yeah, the crack epidemic was this period of time, like mostly in the mid 1980s, where crack cocaine use just exploded, and there were a lot of really bad consequences.
Yeah.
And sadly, it was really bad in impoverished communities in major U.S. cities.
So like what were the factors behind this like sudden increase in crack cocaine use?
Well, there were a lot of things going on, social and economic inequalities, like a lack of opportunities in these communities, and also the fact that crack was really cheap and easy to get, all created this like perfect storm.
It's interesting how those like socioeconomic factors played into the spread of crack cocaine. Like it wasn't just the drug itself, it was the environment that it like thrived in.
Exactly. Understanding the context is really important. And what's even crazier is that like as the crack epidemic started to slow down in the 90s, another stimulant, crystal meth, started to come up. And it really makes you wonder about how drug trends like evolve and all the different things that contribute to them.
Yeah, like the rise and fall of these drug trends, it's almost like a predictable cycle in a way. And maybe there's something to be learned there about how to address these issues better.
Yeah, that's a really good point and something to think about more. But let's dig into what actually happens when someone uses crack cocaine. The article talked about like a feeling of euphoria. So like what's happening in the brain to create that.
Right.
So crack cocaine causes like a rapid release of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is like this neurotransmitter that's tied to feeling good and reward.
Okay.
And that big rush of dopamine creates that intense feeling of euphoria, that high that people chase after.
So it's like taking a shortcut to feeling good, but
Yeah.
I'm guessing there's a price to pay, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So while it can feel really good at first, there is a downside. Crack cocaine can lead to insomnia, anxiety, and sometimes even really bad paranoia.
That sounds like a crazy roller coaster of emotions. And what happens when that like initial rush of dopamine wears off?
That's the dangerous part. So the dopamine levels then crash,
Yeah.
and the person is left feeling depressed and usually craving more of the drug to get back to that first euphoric feeling.
Oh, wow.
And that cycle of highs and lows is like the main thing that drives addiction.
So the crash is like just as powerful as the high, and
Yeah.
that's what makes people want more.
Exactly. And that's how the addiction takes hold.
It's amazing and kind of scary how our brains are like programmed to look for these good feelings, even when we know that there are bad consequences.
The brain is super powerful, and understanding how drugs mess with its reward system is like the key to understanding addiction.
Well, we've talked about the immediate effects, but let's talk about the long-term health risks of using crack cocaine. I mean, obviously addiction is a big one, but are there other risks beyond that?
You're totally right to point that out. The risks go way beyond just addiction.
Okay.
Smoking crack specifically is linked to certain health problems that might not be as common with other ways of using cocaine.
Okay, so what kind of damage are we talking about?
Well, first of all, it puts a lot of stress on your heart and blood vessels.
Mm-hmm.
It can make your heart rate and blood pressure go way up, which over time can cause heart problems or even heart attacks.
And I'm guessing it's not good for your lungs either.
No, you're right. That hot smoke is really rough on the delicate tissues in your lungs. In fact, there's actually a condition called crack lung that's specifically caused by smoking crack cocaine.
Crack lung. That sounds pretty serious.
It is. There's like a super intense reaction in your lungs, and the symptoms are like a bad cough, coughing up blood, and trouble breathing.
It's crazy to me how fast a drug can go from this fleeting high to something that could actually kill you.
Yeah. Your body is tough, but it can only take so much abuse.
I think it's time to explore some of the ideas and issues that people have about crack cocaine. The article mentioned crack babies. And I remember hearing a lot about that back in the 80s and 90s, and it seemed like there was a lot of fear and misinformation going around at the time.
Yeah, crack babies was a term that got blown way out of proportion.
Right.
It refers to babies that are born to moms who used crack while they were pregnant.
Okay.
And people were really scared and making all these exaggerated claims about the damage it would do to these kids, like it was irreversible.
So is that fear, justified? What does the research actually say about the impact of using crack cocaine during pregnancy?
So more research has given us a better picture. And while it's definitely risky to use cocaine during pregnancy, the initial panic about inevitable catastrophic damage was just overblown. Studies have shown that if you isolate crack cocaine use during pregnancy from other things like using alcohol or other environmental factors, then the impact on a child's development is not as bad as they first thought.
So while there are still risks with using crack cocaine during pregnancy, the whole crack babies thing was more about fear than facts.
That's a fair assessment, but it is super important to say that using cocaine while pregnant in any form can still cause things like premature birth, low birth weight, and maybe some developmental delays. The National Institute on Drug Abuse is still warning people to be careful, and they stress how important it is to protect both the mom and the baby's health.
So it's complicated with lots of nuances, and it shows how important it is to look past those sensational headlines and understand the science behind these issues.
Exactly. Science can help us separate fact from fiction and make better decisions.
Well, speaking of informed decisions, let's move on to the legal stuff about crack cocaine. The article briefly talked about its legal status. Can you expand on that?
So in most countries, crack cocaine and powder cocaine are treated the same under the law. It's illegal to make, possess, or sell them, period.
But the article also said something about different sentencing rules for crack versus powder cocaine in the U.S. Can you explain that?
Yeah, you're right. The U.S. had this super controversial difference in sentencing for a long time.
Yeah.
The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 made the penalties way harsher for crack cocaine offenses than for powder cocaine offenses.
Really?
And people were really critical of it. They said it was racially biased and unfair.
So how different was the sentencing?
Oh, it was a huge difference.
Wow.
For example, if you had 5 grams of crack cocaine, you automatically got at least 5 years in prison without parole.
Wow.
But for powder cocaine, you'd have to have 500 grams to get the same sentence. That's like a 100-to-1 ratio.
That's crazy. Basically, people were getting much harsher sentences for the same drug just because it was in a different form.
Exactly. And as you can imagine, this really hurt minority communities where crack cocaine was more common.
So it wasn't just about the drug. It was about who was using it and the biases that were already in the legal system.
That's a key point. Luckily, the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 made the difference smaller, down to 18-to-1, but it didn't get rid of it completely. There's still work to be done to make sure drug sentencing is fair and equal.
Yeah. Well, at least it's moving towards a more just system. So now I'm curious about something else. That the article mentioned something that seems kind of lighter, the slang terms for crack cocaine. So why is the language around the strike so interesting?
What's really cool about the language around drugs is how it changes and shows cultural attitudes and trends, and crack cocaine especially has a ton of slang terms, almost like a secret language, which I think shows how widespread it was and how people needed to talk about it, even in code.
So what are some of the more colorful terms that come to mind?
Some are pretty basic, like rock or gravel because of how it looks, but then you got more creative ones like kibbles and bits, Roxanne, even 7-Up. It's like a whole linguistic playground.
Right.
And these terms can be different depending on where you are, and they change over time too.
Kibbles and bits. That's a new one for me.
Yeah.
So what do these slang terms tell us about how people thought about crack cocaine in different communities?
That's a great question. Those terms give us a glimpse into the subculture surrounding crack cocaine, like how people tried to make it seem normal or even cool. And it's like looking into the social dynamics and attitudes around the drug.
It's like solving a cultural puzzle.
Yeah.
You can learn so much about a society by looking at the language it uses, especially for things that are taboo like drugs.
You got it. Language is a powerful tool. It can tell us a lot about what's happening beneath the surface.
So before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to touch on one more thing from the article, those high-profile political scandals that involve crack cocaine. What makes these scandals so important to understanding this drug?
These scandals are like a big wake-up call. They show us that crack cocaine isn't limited to one group of people. It can affect anyone, even those who are powerful and influential.
Right.
The article specifically mentioned Rob Ford, the former mayor of Toronto, and Marion Barry, the former mayor of Washington, D.C. Can you remind us what happened in those cases?
So both of them got caught up in really public scandals that involved crack cocaine, and their stories caused a lot of debate and discussion about drug use hypocrisy and what happens when someone gets addicted, no matter what their social status is.
Yeah, it really breaks those stereotypes and shows that addiction can happen at any level of society.
Exactly, and it shows us that we need to treat addiction like a public health issue, not like some moral failing.
It's been a really insightful journey so far, exploring all the different aspects of crack cocaine, from its chemical makeup to its impact on individuals and society, and I'm sure there's so much more to learn.
You're right, we've only just scratched the surface. There's always more to consider with something as complicated as this. Well, for those of you listening, stay tuned as we dive deeper into the world of crack cocaine. After a quick break, we'll be back soon to continue our exploration.
See you in a few.
All right.
So before the break, we were talking about how crack cocaine affects like way more than just the person using it.
Right.
So now let's kind of zoom in and look at the science behind how it affects the brain.
Okay. So we know that crack cocaine like messes with the brain's reward system,
Yeah.
Specifically dopamine. But I'm curious about how it actually works. I mean, how does crack actually affect the brain on a neurological level?
It all comes down to how crack cocaine interacts with dopamine.
Okay.
Dopamine is like this really important neurotransmitter. You can think of it as like a chemical messenger in the brain.
Okay.
And it's responsible for those feelings of pleasure and reward. So when someone smokes crack, it's basically like flooding their brain with a ton of dopamine.
So it's like hitting the brain's feel-good button on overdrive.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. A crack doesn't just make more dopamine, it actually blocks the reuptake of dopamine. So it's basically trapping it in the brain.
Wait, reuptake? That sounds kind of technical. Can you explain that a little bit?
Okay, so imagine there are these tiny little vacuum cleaners in your brain, and they're constantly sucking up any extra dopamine after it's done its job of signaling pleasure.
Okay.
That's reuptake. It's how the brain keeps things balanced and prevents too much stimulation.
So those little vacuum cleaners are keeping the dopamine levels in check.
Exactly. But crack cocaine like throws a wrench in the system. It blocks those vacuum cleaners, those dopamine transporters, and that causes dopamine to build up between neurons in this space called the synapse. And this leads to longer stimulation, and it makes those pleasurable effects way stronger, so the high is much more intense and lasts longer.
So it's not just about making more dopamine, it's about keeping it around longer and letting it hang out in the brain.
Exactly. And that constant dopamine is what eventually leads to those intense cravings and the compulsive drug-seeking behavior that we see in addiction. It's like the brain gets hooked on that dopamine surge and just wants more, more, more.
Wow, it's amazing how these tiny little processes in our brains can have such a big impact on our behavior and ultimately our lives.
It really is remarkable, and the more we learn about these brain mechanisms, the closer we get to finding better treatments for addiction.
Speaking of addiction, the article mentioned that smoking crack is often considered the most addictive form of cocaine. Is there any truth to that, or is it more complicated than that?
It's definitely more complicated. While crack does have a reputation for being super addictive, it's not really about the drug itself being stronger. It's more about how it's used and how fast it gets to the brain.
So you're saying that just because someone smokes crack, it doesn't automatically mean they'll get addicted.
Exactly. Think about it. Injecting cocaine actually gets the drug to the brain even faster than smoking it.
Okay.
But we don't necessarily say that injection is the most addictive way to use it.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So what are the things that actually make someone more likely to get addicted to crack cocaine, or any drug for that matter?
Addiction is complicated. It's a mix of biological, psychological, and social factors. Some people are just genetically predisposed to addiction, meaning their brains might react more strongly to drugs. Other people might have experienced trauma or mental health issues that make them more vulnerable. And of course, the environment plays a huge role. If you're around drug use all the time, it's a lot harder to resist.
So it's not as simple as just saying crack is the most addictive and leaving it at that. It's about understanding the person and their situation.
Exactly. Each person's experience with addiction is unique, and understanding that is key to providing effective help and support.
So let's talk about help and support then. What are some treatment options for people who are struggling with crack cocaine addiction?
Unfortunately, there's no quick fix or one-size-fits-all cure for addiction.
Right.
But there are evidence-based treatments that have been shown to help people recover.
What are some of those approaches that have been successful?
Behavioral therapies are often like the foundation of treatment. One of the most effective is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Okay, and how does CBT help someone overcome addiction?
CBT focuses on helping people identify and change negative thought patterns and behaviors that contribute to drug use. It's about breaking those unhealthy cycles and giving people tools to deal with cravings, manage triggers, and make healthier choices.
So it's like rewiring the brain in a way to create new, healthier pathways.
Yeah, exactly. It's about empowering people to take control of their thoughts and actions instead of being controlled by the addiction. Another effective approach is contingency management, which uses positive reinforcement to encourage people to stay abstinent.
Oh, that's interesting. How does that work?
It's pretty simple. People earn rewards for staying drug-free, usually based on negative drug tests. It's like a system of positive reinforcement encouraging healthy behaviors.
It's like training a puppy, rewarding good behavior to make them do it more.
That's a great analogy, and it's actually really effective. So while behavioral therapies are super important, we can't forget about medication in addiction treatment.
Right. Are there medications that can help specifically with crack cocaine addiction?
Sadly, there aren't any FDA-approved medications specifically for crack cocaine addiction right now.
Okay.
But some medications can help manage withdrawal symptoms and co-occurring mental health conditions like depression or anxiety, which can make recovery harder.
So even though medication might not be a solution on its own, it can still play a supporting role in the overall treatment plan.
Exactly. And it's really important to emphasize that medication should always be used along with therapy and other support services. It's about taking a holistic approach to recovery.
So what about preventing crack cocaine use in the first place? What are some effective strategies to keep people from going down that path?
Well, prevention is always the best approach, right?
Yeah.
One effective strategy is community-based programs that teach young people about the dangers of drugs. These programs can provide a safe space for young people to learn about healthy choices, build resilience skills, and resist peer pressure.
So it's about creating environments that support healthy development and giving young people the tools to navigate those tough teenage years.
Exactly. And it's not just about telling them to just say no. It's about giving them the knowledge, skills, and confidence to make their own informed decisions.
It's like giving them a strong foundation so they can build a healthy life without needing drugs to cope.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. But we also have to remember that drug use often comes from deeper societal problems like poverty, lack of opportunity, exposure to violence. These are all risk factors that need to be addressed.
So while individual choices do matter, it's also about creating a society that provides opportunities and support for everyone, no matter where they come from.
Absolutely. It's about addressing the root causes of drug use and building communities where people can thrive.
This conversation has really shown how complex crack cocaine addiction is. It's not just about a drug, it's about this whole web of social, economic, and personal factors.
It's about seeing addiction as a health issue, not a moral failing, and understanding the science behind it.
Speaking of science, we've talked a lot about the biological and psychological aspects of crack cocaine, but the article also mentioned its cultural significance.
Right.
Crack cocaine has been in movies, music, and literature, often in very different ways. So why is it important to think about how it's been portrayed in pop culture.
That's a great point. Crack cocaine has become this powerful symbol, and it means different things to different people.
Yeah.
For some, it represents despair, poverty, and the terrible impact it had on communities, especially back in the 80s and 90s. But for others, it's connected to a certain time period, a music scene, or a cultural movement.
Like I'm thinking of movies like New Jack City and Boys in the Hood that showed the harsh realities of how crack cocaine affected communities.
Exactly. Those films were like stark reminders of the damage that crack cocaine caused, especially in Black and brown communities. During that time, they forced people to confront the systemic inequalities that allowed the drug to spread and the tragic human cost.
But then you also have hip-hop music from that same time that seemed to glorify crack cocaine and the drug trade. It's like two sides of the same coin.
That's true. Some artists, especially in gangster rap, use their music to talk about their own experiences, which often included drugs and violence. And this caused a lot of controversy, with some people saying that these artists were glamorizing a dangerous lifestyle.
It's interesting how art can be both a reflection of reality and something that can influence it.
It's a complicated relationship, and it's important to remember that art is subjective and open to interpretation. What one person sees as glorification, another might see as social commentary or just reflecting a harsh reality.
It reminds us that there are always multiple perspectives to consider when it comes to complex issues like this, and those different viewpoints can lead to more meaningful conversations and understanding.
Absolutely. It's about embracing the nuances and having thoughtful dialogue.
This deep dive has been so enlightening. We've gone from the inner workings of the brain to the heart of communities, exploring the science, the history, the social impact, and even the cultural interpretations of crack cocaine.
Yeah, it's been fascinating unpacking all the layers of this often misunderstood drug.
And for those of you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on crack cocaine. But it doesn't end here. This is just the beginning of your exploration.
There's always more to learn and discover. We encourage you to continue your own deep dive into this complex and multifaceted issue.
Now let's move on to another important part of the conversation about crack cocaine, harm reduction strategies. Stay with us as we explore this sometimes controversial approach after a quick break. So welcome back to our deep dive into the world of crack cocaine. We've been talking about its impact on society, the science behind its addictive nature, and even how it's portrayed in pop culture. And now I want to kind of shift gears and explore something that often causes debate: harm reduction.
Yeah, so harm reduction is like this public health approach that tries to minimize the bad stuff that can happen from drug use, but it doesn't necessarily require abstinence.
Okay.
It's a philosophy that acknowledges that drug use is real, and it aims to make it safer regardless of whether someone is actively trying to quit.
So it's about recognizing that, like, quitting isn't always the immediate goal, and meeting people where they are in their journey.
Exactly. Harm reduction is all about practical strategies to reduce the risk of overdose, prevent the spread of diseases, and improve the overall well-being of people who use drugs. It's about providing support and resources without judging.
Can you give some examples of how harm reduction strategies work with crack cocaine use?
Sure, one common strategy is providing sterile crack pipes.
Okay.
Now, that might sound a little counterintuitive, but it actually helps reduce the spread of infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis C, which can be transmitted through shared pipes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sharing dirty needles or pipes is a serious health risk no matter what substance is involved.
Right. Another important strategy is offering drug chilling services.
Okay.
These services allow people to have their drugs tested for purity and to see if they're in dangerous additives.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and knowing that information can help users make more informed choices about their consumption and potentially avoid overdoses.
So it's like giving people the tools to be safer, even if they aren't ready to quit using altogether.
Exactly. Harm reduction is about empowering individuals and giving them agency, even in the midst of their struggles with addiction. It's about recognizing their humanity and providing support without judgment.
What about those supervised consumption sites? I've heard of those, but aren't they mostly for people who inject drugs?
Yeah, supervised consumption sites, or safe injection sites as they're sometimes called, are more commonly associated with injection drug use. But the concept can definitely be applied to crack cocaine smokers too.
Okay.
These sites provide a safe and clean space where people can use drugs under the supervision of trained medical professionals.
So even though you smoke crack and don't inject it, the same principles of safety and supervision still apply.
Absolutely. The main goal is to prevent fatal overdoses. Staff at these sites are trained to administer naloxone, which is a medication that can reverse an opioid overdose. But beyond that, these sites also offer sterile supplies, education about safer drug use, and connections to other support services like treatment and housing.
Wow, it sounds like a really comprehensive way to address the needs of people who use drugs and reduce the harms associated with it.
It is. It's about shifting the focus away from punishment and judgment and towards compassion and care. It's about recognizing that people who use drugs are human beings deserving of support and respect.
But I imagine there are people who push back against these types of strategies. I mean, they seem to challenge traditional views on drug policy.
Yeah, there's definitely controversy around harm reduction.
Right.
Some people argue that these strategies enable drug use or send the message that it's okay.
Okay.
They worry that providing sterile supplies or safe consumption sites is like condoning risky behavior.
So what do people who support harm reduction say to those concerns?
They argue that harm reduction is about being practical and meeting people where they are not about saying drug use is fine. The reality is people are using drugs whether we like it or not. So the question is, how can we minimize the negative consequences? And the evidence shows that harm reduction strategies actually work. They save lives and reduce harm.
It seems like the debate often comes down to different values and philosophies, abstinence versus a more practical approach to reducing harm.
That's a big part of it, but it's also important to look at the evidence. Research consistently shows that harm reduction strategies are effective in reducing overdoses, preventing the spread of diseases, and connecting people to treatment and support services.
So it's not just about ideology, it's about what actually works in the real world.
Exactly, and the data clearly supports the effectiveness of harm reduction approaches.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. We've explored so much, the science, the history, the social impact, and the ethical considerations around crack cocaine. It's been a fascinating journey unpacking the complexities of this often misunderstood drug. And for those of you listening, we hope this deep dive has given you a more nuanced perspective on crack cocaine, its history, its effects, and the conversations happening around its use and impact on individuals and society. We've only scratched the surface, but hopefully we've sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to keep exploring this complex issue. Remember, knowledge is power. The more we understand about drugs and addiction, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions, support those who are struggling, and create a safer, more compassionate world. Until next time, keep diving deep.